Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio Network, a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC, to educate, to enlighten, to entertain. And on this week's episode, we're doing a special podcast on U.S. presidents abusing their power. And is there precedents, meaning before, where this has taken place? And the answer is yes. It is an article that was put out by a gentleman named the name of Larry Holzwarth, Holzwarth, May 18th, 2019. And the title of his is called These Leaders Were Accused of Abusing Their Power. Now, you might think that the present and current president is guilty of this, or maybe Richard Nixon with Watergate. However, it's been happening since the beginning of our country with our first president, George Washington. And he claimed he was executive power, as he put it, and the privilege, which meant that he exercised his authority to the point of being accused of abusing his powers while in office and changed the course of history by it. And it's also noted in the records that presidents have long sought the ways and means of accomplishing their goals, which they deem critical despite the opposition of a reluctant Congress. Some were quite successful, while others didn't quite make it, as only Nixon went to China, but he also almost was, and he did get asked to leave office. And that was just one of them. So, if you're wondering, have the presidents done that? Oh, yes. So, we're going to give you some examples so you know who to compare against in the present office of the United States and why you should be careful. The first one, of course, that comes to mind is the John Jay Treaty, which Washington claimed we needed. And in that treaty, John Jay negotiated a treaty with the British that gave them favorable trade status and raised shouts of Washington abusing his presidential powers. Of course, this took place during the French Revolution. Why do presidents abuse their power? Well, it depends what they're after and what they feel would help them advance their agenda by doing what they did. So, what were they after? Could be the acquisition of territory, like the Louisiana Purchase, the waging of war. War of 1812 comes to mind. The suspension of citizens' legal rights, Abraham Lincoln, Civil War, habeas corpus, or their suppression under illegal circumstances. What they all have in common, though, is the belief by the president that the action was necessary for the benefit of the nation, despite political opposition at the time. Some presidents question the legality of their actions under the Constitution, but still abuse their powers anyways. Others ignored the Constitution totally, or its restraints on their power, which they knew eventually would be overturned. We've already had two of them. One, Mr. Trump tried to get rid of grants and loans, and he didn't care who he took out with that, and the birthright of a person being born in the United States comes to mind. So here are some examples for you to think about and make some comparisons about what's going on in today's political arena. So, as I said, there are also calls for Mr. George Washington's impeachment, and this took place during the French Revolutionary War. Washington declared the United States to be neutral, denying support both to the British and to the French. But when the John Jay negotiated a treaty with the British, which, among other things, brought the United States and Britain close together in trade relations and in Indian affairs, the congressmen from the southern states opposed it. Despite it being ratified in the Senate, members of the House sought to overturn it in effect by refusing to authorize the funding needed to allow the terms to be met. Congress demanded the president provide them with all documentation covering the treaty's negotiation, including all correspondence between the president and John Jay, and Washington refused. And although he did not directly refer to what later became known as today executive privilege, his argument in refusal established the president, President, for that term. There were calls in the House for Washington's impeachment in early 1797 as a result. The Jay Treaty was eventually funded by the House in a vote which carried by a margin of 3. And once in place did much to lead to the quasi-war with France during the subsequent administration of John Adams, which he probably didn't like too much. The next person on the line was Thomas Jefferson, when he abused his powers and violated the Constitution when he negotiated through agents the purchase of Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte. Even the validity of French ownership of the land involved was called into question, but the primary argument supporting Jefferson's abuse was that the Constitution did not give the executive power to purchase land and expand the boundaries of American territory, which also brings us to the president's administration of Canada, Panama, and Greenland. Case in point. But Mr. Jefferson pointed out that the Constitution gave the president the authority, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to negotiate treaties, and the Louisiana Purchase was just that, a treaty. After the Senate ratified the purchase of the land, the House reluctantly authorized its funding. During the debate, the House voted on a motion to deny funding for the treaty, which failed by only 2 votes. And despite the large charges of Jefferson's abuse of power, the Louisiana Purchase was funded, more than doubling the power and the territory of the United States for about 3 cents an acre. Then you have John Quincy Adams and the conflict with Georgia. And that power was in a dispute over individual states' rights to make treaties with the Indians. Almost similar to the point that the present administration opened a dam and flooded California, much to the chagrin of the farmers who were counting on that water source to keep their crops green and alive for the upcoming summer. During John Quincy Adams' presidency, the midterm elections led to the opposition party achieving firm control of Congress. Adams found himself unable to obtain legislation which supported his ambitious agenda in domestic affairs, as the Jacksonian Democrats stood in opposition to the president. In those days, the president and the vice president didn't have to come from the same party. Of course, they changed that later on. But then you could have a Republican while a Democrat was president, or Republican with a Democrat for vice president. The Jacksonians supported Indian removal west of the Mississippi, and when Adams learned of a treaty with the Muskogee Indians, which had been opposed by them by the governor of Georgia, George Trope, he used his office to suspend the treaty and dispatch negotiators, which arrived at a new treaty, allowing the Muskogee to remain in Georgia. Now, the governor of Georgia refused the new treaty, accusing the president of abuse of power, which interfered with the rights of his state, and exhorted the citizens of Georgia to ignore the federal treaty and evict the Muskogee from their tribal lands. Also, similar to what Trump is doing with the immigration policy and telling the individual states, don't get in my way, I will bring the military and wipe you out. Not too different, same thought process, actually. The showdown was averted when it was another treaty was the Muskogee tribe was reached. The Indians were removed to what later became Alabama, and the issue of Adams' abuse of power cost him the support of the South and some Western states during the election of 1828, leading to his defeat. And then you have Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States. Henry Clay moved to censor the president over his actions regarding the Bank of the United States. President Andrew Jackson's expansion of presidential power was demonstrated in many areas, but perhaps none more flagrant than his determination to exterminate the Second Bank of the United States in 1833. He intended to cripple the bank by removing its deposit and distributing them to banks throughout the states, which became known as pet banks to the opposition. At the time, the United States government did not issue paper money. Banknotes were issued by the state banks, and the receipt of deposit from the Bank of the United States led the pet banks to issue an increasing amount of paper money, leading to inflation. Jackson refused to recharter the Bank of the United States in the belief that it held too much power. You could say that's relative to getting rid of the income tax and just using the power of the tariffs, which will lead to high inflation because the tax is not only for outgoing exports, but also incoming, our imports. So that drives up the price because the United States cannot replace many of the objects coming in from other countries. Therefore, people have less money to spend. Therefore, they'll pay more for it. Therefore, the price of everything just shoots up through the ceiling. By 1834, opposition to Jackson had led to the formation of the Whig Party, a movement within the Senate led by Henry Clay to censor the president. Politically motivated by Clay, who intended to use a censor as an issue during the next presidential election, the motion passed by a vote of 26-20, and Jackson was officially censored by the Senate in March 1834. Jackson responded by saying that Clay was, quote, as full of fury as a drunken man in a brothel. The House of Representatives supported Jackson, passing resolutions which agreed that the bank should not be rechartered and that the deposit should not be returned, which the Senate had demanded. In January of 1835, Jackson succeeded in completing paying off the national debt, the only time that feat has been accomplished in American history. Well, we can honestly say that the American debt in the current 21st century will not stand the test of time and will not be paid off. Stay tuned for next week's section where we will go into John Taylor and the impeachment proceedings in the House of Reps. So you can learn more about the history that apparently our schools forgot to include, which led one to believe that this type of corruption and abuse of power has been going on since our country was first created, and democracy isn't quite true democracy or a true republic. If you want to hear other programs that will open up your eyes and ears to what's really going on in the world, please join Betsy Wurtzel on Chatting with Betsy with her program. Or if you're inclined more to sports, go join Dan Riley with sports commentary, and he'll give you an earful as well. Podcasting is not just about the prettiness and how great everything is, but what is really wrong with our country and what we need to do. As John F. Kennedy once said, do what you can do for your country, not what your country can do with you. Because if you don't have a country, it's a moot point. Thank you very much for listening to Lest We Forget with your host, Lillian Cauldwell. You can hear this program over at Spreaker.com/Passionate World Talk Radio, as well as going over to our website, PassionateWorldTalkRadio.com. Scroll down to the end where it says Current of State Affairs. Click on that, takes you to a web page, also to a Google link. Click on that, and that will take you inside the belly of the beast on youtube.com/Passionate World Radio, underline PW Talk Radio, and listen to all and view all the videos. Program is supported by the Obstacles of Podcast Training, a 2-month course, Monday through Friday, 45 minutes, 20 minutes for lecture, 20 minutes for learning what you just learned. Check it out at https://educate.passionateworldtalkradio.com/masterclass. Learn how to get your voice heard over the airwaves. The 21st century is a verbal and visual world. Take advantage of it. And by http://AIwithlillian.com. Go check out the website. It will take you to my flex.ai and learn about artificial intelligence. Start learning it now, because by the time your child graduates from high school, it'll be compulsory for them to have. So mom and dad, start learning it now. Excuse me, because you'll only get more difficult later on if you put it off. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, one more thing coming at the beginning of March, a new program dealing with women 55 and older who are still working, moving forward, contributing to the community, other families, to the world. Please join us. Become involved. This program won't make it without your interaction and with your voices. Contact us as PWR Network LLC at gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening, and have an awesome weekend.